Every legendary band has their glory days, the albums that define a generation, the tracks that still get played decades later. But here's the dirty little secret. Even the greatest rock gods stumble. Sometimes they don't just stumble. They faceplant, leaving behind records so baffling, so misguided, that fans pretend they never happened. This countdown isn't about forgotten garage bands or unknown flops. No, we're looking at the heavyweights. The bands and artists with platinum records and iconic legacies, who managed to deliver absolute train wrecks. Whether it was chasing trends, giving into ego, or just running out of steam, these albums remind us that even legends can make mistakes. From ill-fated experiments to overproduced disasters, these are the albums that critics trashed, fans abandoned, and musicians themselves later regretted. So buckle up. Here are the top 10 worst rock albums of all time. Number 10. Kiss, Music from the Elder.
World without heroes is like a world without sun.
By 1981, Kiss were already arena rock giants, known for fire-breathing, face paint, and big, dumb fun. But instead of doubling down on what made them famous, they decided to reinvent themselves as a progressive rock band. The result was Music from the Elder, a concept album so confusing that even die-hard Kiss fans didn't know what to make of it. The idea was to tell a fantasy story about a young hero's quest against evil, complete with orchestras, choirs, and spoken-word interludes. Sounds ambitious, right? The problem was that Kiss weren't Pink Floyd or Genesis. They were a hard rock party band trying to play dress-up in someone else's genre. Tracks like The Oath and Just a Boy felt awkward and out of place, while ballads like Odyssey sounded more Broadway than rock and roll. Even the band didn't seem to know what they were doing. Producer Bob Ezrin, fresh off Pink Floyd's The Wall, pushed for a high-concept narrative. But the record company forced changes, chopping up the track list and killing any sense of story. What was left was a muddled album that didn't work as a concept and didn't work as a Kiss record either. Fans were baffled. Critics were brutal. The album flopped commercially, failing to crack the US Top 40 and becoming one of Kiss's worst-selling releases ever. Concert tours were scrapped, and the band quickly abandoned the material, never performing much of it again. Ironically, some fans have since found a cult fascination with The Elder, admiring its ambition even if it was disastrously executed. But for most, it stands as proof that sometimes bands should stick to what they do best. Kiss were never meant to be mythic storytellers. They were meant to make the ground shake with anthems like Rock and Roll All Night. And with Music from the Elder, they learned that lesson the hard way. Number 9. Guns N' Roses, Chinese Democracy. Few albums in rock history carried more hype or more disappointment than Chinese Democracy. After the monumental success of Appetite for Destruction and the Use Your Illusion albums, fans waited more than a decade for the next Guns N' Roses release. By the time it finally dropped, expectations were sky high, and the end product left almost everyone scratching their heads. The problem started with the endless delays. Recording stretched on for nearly 15 years, with a revolving door of producers, engineers, and musicians. At one point, the project cost upwards of $13 million, making it one of the most expensive rock albums ever produced. That bloated process showed in the music. Instead of a focused, dangerous rock record, fans got a sprawling mess of industrial influences, overproduction, and tracks that didn't feel like the band they once knew. Songs like Better and There Was a Time had flashes of brilliance, but the album was weighed down by layers of effects, samples, and Axl Rose's obsession with perfection. The raw energy that made Guns N' Roses iconic in the late 80s was gone, replaced by a sterile patchwork sound. With Slash, Duff McKagan, and most of the classic lineup absent, it didn't even feel like a Guns N' Roses album. More like Axl's solo project hiding behind the band's name. The backlash was immediate. Critics slammed it for being overworked and soulless, while fans who had waited more than a decade felt betrayed. Sure, it debuted high on the charts, but sales plummeted almost as quickly, and it never came close to matching the band's past glory. Instead of reasserting Guns N' Roses as rock gods, it became a punchline about rock's excesses. Looking back, Chinese Democracy isn't unlistenable. Some even defend it as a bold experiment. But as the payoff to years of hype, it was a colossal letdown. It showed that sometimes too much time, too much money, and too much control can drain the life out of even the most dangerous bands. Number 8. Bob Dylan, Self-Portrait.
You just lay there by the juniper.
When Bob Dylan released Self-Portrait, fans thought they were about to get another stroke of genius from the man who redefined folk and rock in the 60s. Instead, what they got was one of the most baffling albums ever put out by a major artist. To this day, it's debated whether Dylan intentionally made a bad record or if he simply lost his way. The double album was sprawling, 24 tracks across 2 records. But quantity didn't equal quality. Instead of his usual sharp songwriting, Dylan filled it with questionable covers, awkward live cuts, and songs that sounded tossed off. Tracks like Blue Moon and I Forgot More Than You'll Ever Know felt more like half-hearted karaoke than genuine interpretations, and his famously nasal voice was buried under layers of syrupy production. Critics tore it to shreds. The most famous takedown came from Rolling Stone's Greil Marcus, who opened his review with the immortal line, "What is this shit?" Fans felt the same. How could the man behind Blonde on Blonde and Highway 61 Revisited suddenly churn out something so bland and uninspired? Some argue Dylan was playing games. By his own admission, he was tired of being treated like a prophet and wanted to knock himself off the pedestal. Self-Portrait, in that sense, was almost a middle finger to the people who demanded greatness from him at every turn. If that was the plan, it worked. But it also meant sacrificing an album's worth of credibility in the process. Over time, a handful of defenders have tried to rehabilitate the record, pointing out a few gems buried in the mess. But the overall consensus hasn't changed much. Self-Portrait was Dylan's most public stumble, a record that confused his audience and damaged his reputation at a critical moment. It proved that even geniuses can make mistakes. And when Dylan faltered, he did it in spectacular double-album fashion. Number 7, Queen and Paul Rodgers, The Cosmos Rocks.
I wanna be heard. I want to be seen.
When Queen announced they were carrying on without Freddie Mercury, the rock world was divided. On one hand, fans were thrilled to see Brian May and Roger Taylor back on stage. On the other, many felt the magic of Queen couldn't be replicated. Teaming up with blues rock singer Paul Rodgers, best known from Free and Bad Company, seemed like a bold choice. But when the Cosmos Rocks finally landed in 2008, it fell flat with both critics and longtime fans. The biggest problem was that it didn't sound like Queen. Rodgers' voice, though powerful, lacked the operatic flair and theatrical punch that defined Mercury. Instead of flamboyant rock epics like Bohemian Rhapsody or Somebody to Love, the album leaned heavily into bluesy jams and straightforward rock songs. Tracks like Celebrity and Still Burnin' felt generic, missing the spark of innovation that had always set Queen apart. The production didn't help either. For a band once synonymous with sonic experimentation, the record sounded surprisingly bland. Gone were the layered harmonies, dramatic arrangements, and studio wizardry. What remained was a safe, almost faceless rock album that could have come from any bar band. Except this was Queen. Critics were harsh. But the real sting came from fans who had hoped for something worthy of Mercury's legacy. Many accused the band of tarnishing their own history by putting out an album that felt more like a side project than a proper Queen record. Even Rodgers himself later admitted the partnership wasn't built to last, and the collaboration quietly ended after a short tour. Today, The Cosmos Rocks is mostly remembered as an odd footnote in Queen's career. While May and Taylor still tour successfully with Adam Lambert, this record stands as proof that not every comeback is worth making. Sometimes, the legend is better left untouched. Number 6. Lou Reed and Metallica. Lulu.
Second guessing. Based on feeling I am the truth.
Some collaborations sound strange on paper, but work in practice. Lou Reed and Metallica, however, was as messy in reality as it looked on the surface. When these two giants teamed up in 2011 for Lulu, fans hoped for an intriguing fusion of Reed's avant-garde storytelling and Metallica's thrash power. Instead, the album became infamous as one of the most painful listening experiences in modern rock history. The record was based on two early 20th century German plays by Frank Wedekind, with Reed spinning dark, abstract lyrics while Metallica pounded out heavy, repetitive riffs. On its own, that might have been interesting. But the execution was disastrous. Reed's vocals often sounded detached and spoken more than sung, while Metallica thundered behind him in a way that felt mismatched rather than collaborative. The result was a jarring clash that pleased neither Lou Reed fans nor Metallica diehards. The most notorious track, The View, sparked endless ridicule online, thanks to Reed's bizarre declaration, "I am the table." That single line became a meme and symbolized just how awkward and unintentional the comedy of Lulu could be. Fans who had been promised something groundbreaking instead got an album so divisive that many couldn't make it through a single full listen. Critics weren't kind either. While a few publications defended its ambition, the majority tore it apart. Some called it self-indulgent, others simply unlistenable. For Metallica, it was seen as one of the lowest points in their career, while Reed, ever the contrarian, shrugged off the backlash, claiming people just didn't understand the art. Over time, Lulu has developed a strange cult following. Some listeners revisit it as a so bad it's fascinating piece of rock history, while others argue it deserves credit for at least trying something different. But no matter how you spin it, the album remains more infamous than admired. Ultimately, Lulu stands as a reminder that even legendary artists can stumble when ego and ambition outweigh chemistry. It wasn't just a bad record, it was a train wreck of expectations colliding. Number 5. The Clash, Cut the Crap. By the time Cut the Crap was released in 1985, the Clash were already in a state of collapse. Their previous record, Combat Rock, had brought mainstream success with hits like Rock the Casbah and Should I Stay or Should I Go? But internal tensions tore the band apart. With drummer Topper Headon long gone and guitarist Mick Jones fired, Joe Strummer and bassist Paul Simonon were left to pick up the pieces. What followed was an album that barely resembled The Clash at all. Instead of the fiery, politically charged punk that made them icons, Cut the Crap was weighed down by synthetic production choices. Manager Bernie Rhodes took over much of the creative process, drowning the songs in cheesy drum machines, glossy keyboards, and awkward choral chants. Tracks like We Are the Clash and Finger Poppin' felt like parodies of the band's former glory, stripped of the raw energy that defined them. Fans and critics alike were horrified. Many saw it not just as a weak record, but as a betrayal of the Clash's legacy. The raw anger and authenticity of albums like London Calling and Sandinista had been replaced by lifeless, manufactured sound. Even Joe Strummer himself later admitted that the album was a mistake and distanced himself from the project whenever it was mentioned. The few bright spots, like This Is England, hinted at what could have been if the band had been allowed to follow their instincts instead of Rhodes's heavy-handed direction. But one decent track couldn't save an album that felt rushed, misguided, and out of touch with the times. Today, Cut the Crap is widely regarded as a cautionary tale. It wasn't just a bad album. It was the sound of a legendary band losing its identity. And while The Clash remain one of rock's most respected names, this final chapter is one most fans prefer to forget. Number 4. Van Halen, Van Halen III. Van Halen's legacy was already complicated by the time they released Van Halen III in 1998. the band had already cycled through two iconic frontmen, David Lee Roth and Sammy Hagar, each leaving behind a distinct era of hits. But when Eddie Van Halen brought in Extreme's Gary Cherone to front the band, fans were curious yet skeptical. What they got was an album that quickly became one of the most maligned entries in the band's catalog. The record was weighed down by its lack of identity. Instead of the flashy, high-energy rock anthems that defined Van Halen III leaned into meandering ballads and experimental tracks that simply didn't suit Cherone's voice. Songs like Without You tried to capture the old magic, but came across flat and uninspired, while others dragged on far too long, losing the tight, punchy spirit fans had come to expect. Critics were merciless. Many pointed out that Eddie, while still a guitar genius, dominated the record to the point where it felt less like a band effort and more like a vanity project. Cherone, despite being a talented singer, seemed mismatched for the material, leaving the entire album without the chemistry that made Van Halen thrive in earlier years. Sales told the story just as clearly. Van Halen III barely cracked the charts and quickly faded into obscurity. The poor reception was so severe that Cherone's tenure with the band lasted only one album, making it one of the shortest-lived chapters in Van Halen history. Looking back, Van Halen III stands as a lesson in how even legendary bands can stumble when chasing reinvention without a clear direction. Instead of ushering in a bold new era, it marked the end of one, and remains a record fans mention only as a cautionary footnote in Van Halen's legacy. Number 3, Smashing Pumpkins, Zeitgeist. When the Smashing Pumpkins reunited in 2007 after a long breakup, fans were buzzing with excitement. Billy Corgan and drummer Jimmy Chamberlin were back together, and the promise of a new album had longtime followers hoping for a return to the band's glory days of Siamese Dream and Melancholy and the Infinite Sadness. But instead of a triumphant comeback, Zeitgeist ended up being one of the most disappointing albums in their catalog. The biggest problem was the lineup itself. With only Corgan and Chamberlin returning, much of the chemistry that defined the original band was missing. The record leaned heavily on Corgan's creative control, and while his ambition had always driven the Pumpkins, this time it resulted in an album that felt bloated and directionless. Tracks like Tarantula had flashes of energy, but the album overall lacked the emotional depth and dynamic range that made the band legendary. Sonically, Zeitgeist was heavy, loud, and relentless, but not in a good way. Instead of the dreamy textures and layered artistry of the Pumpkins' earlier work, the production felt harsh and one-dimensional. Many songs blended together into a wall of noise, with little of the subtlety that once set Corgan's songwriting apart. For longtime fans, it felt like the band had traded nuance for volume. Critics didn't hold back either. Reviews called the album overbearing and self-indulgent, with some pointing out that the record seemed more interested in making a statement than in crafting memorable songs. Even commercially, it couldn't sustain momentum, debuting high on the charts, but fading quickly as word of mouth spread. In the end, Zeitgeist serves as a reminder that reunions don't always capture past magic. Instead of reigniting the Pumpkins' legacy, it highlighted how much had changed, not just in the band, but in the musical landscape around them. For many fans, it was the comeback that fell flat, leaving Zeitgeist as one of rock's most infamous letdowns. Number 2, Creed, Human Clay.
I close my eyes, begin to pray.
Few bands have divided listeners quite like Creed. At the height of their fame in the late 90s and early 2000s, they were selling millions of albums and dominating radio with songs like Higher and With Arms Wide Open. Their 1999 album, Human Clay, was a commercial juggernaut, moving more than 10 million copies in the US alone. But despite its massive success, it has gone down in history as one of the most ridiculed and critically panned albums in modern rock. The record's sound was built on grungy guitars and Scott Stapp's famously dramatic baritone. On paper, it should have worked, but the execution came across as overblown and heavy-handed. Songs like What If and Are You Ready leaned so far into melodrama that they bordered on parody, while With Arms Wide Open became a lightning rod for mockery due to its overly sentimental lyrics. Critics tore Human Clay apart, calling it formulaic, pompous, and lacking any real artistry. The band was accused of mimicking Pearl Jam, but without the depth or subtlety, making them an easy target for music snobs. Even within the broader rock community, Creed quickly became a punchline, with Stapp's vocals often exaggerated in countless parodies. Yet the irony is that Human Clay was beloved by millions at the time. Its polished, radio-friendly sound appealed to mainstream audiences. And for a moment, Creed was one of the biggest bands in the world. But popularity doesn't always equal respect, and the backlash was so severe that it eventually overshadowed the album's commercial triumph. Today, Human Clay stands as a strange paradox, one of the best-selling rock albums of its era, and also one of the most mocked. It's proof that success can sometimes breed contempt, and that critical legacy doesn't always line up with what the charts say. Number 1. Chris Cornell, Scream. Chris Cornell will always be remembered as one of the greatest voices in rock history. But his 2009 solo album, Scream, remains a baffling misstep. Known for his work with Soundgarden and Audioslave, Cornell's reputation was built on powerful vocals, raw emotion, and heavy guitar-driven songs. So when he teamed up with hip-hop producer Timbaland for Scream, fans were blindsided. What they expected was another hard-hitting rock record. What they got instead was glossy pop beats, electronic effects, and a record that felt like it belonged on Top 40 radio rather than in the rock canon. The album tried to fuse Cornell's soaring voice with Timbaland's club-oriented production, but the two worlds never meshed. Tracks like Part of Me and Ground Zero were layered with thumping dance beats, auto-tuned vocals, and slick synths that drowned out Cornell's natural strengths. Instead of highlighting his once-in-a-generation voice, the production often made it sound out of place, forcing him into a style that simply wasn't his own. Fans were furious. Many felt betrayed, as if Cornell had abandoned his roots for a desperate attempt at commercial relevance. Critics weren't any kinder, with reviews calling the album a mess, a midlife crisis in audio form, and even the worst album ever made by a major rock artist. For an artist of Cornell's stature, the backlash was swift and brutal. To his credit, Cornell stood by the project for a time, insisting that he wanted to push boundaries and explore new territory. But the damage was done. The album tanked commercially, alienated longtime fans, and remains a stain on an otherwise stellar career. Even Cornell himself later distanced from the record, acknowledging that it wasn't his proudest moment. Today, Scream serves as a cautionary tale about artistic risk-taking. While experimentation can lead to brilliance, sometimes it leads to disaster. For Cornell, it was a rare stumble, proof that even the most gifted artists can lose their way when straying too far from what made them legendary in the first place. So there you have it. 10 albums that prove even the biggest names in rock can stumble, and sometimes stumble hard. From Kiss trying to reinvent themselves as prog rock storytellers, to Lou Reed and Metallica's surreal experiment, to Chris Cornell's shocking detour into pop, each of these records serves as a reminder that risk and failure often walk hand in hand with greatness. But here's the thing, failure doesn't erase legacy. Kiss still fill arenas. Bob Dylan remains a Nobel Prize-winning legend. Queen's catalog towers over rock history despite the cosmos rocks. And Cornell's voice? Still one of the most unforgettable in music, no matter what happened with Scream. That's the beauty of rock and roll. It's messy, unpredictable, and sometimes it takes a disaster to remind us why the classics shine so brightly. Every bad album becomes part of the story, shaping how we remember these artists not just as icons, but as human beings who dared to take risks. Now it's your turn. Which of these albums do you think is the worst of the worst? And are there any you secretly defend as misunderstood masterpieces? Let us know in the comments, because the debate over rock's greatest failures is never truly over. And don't forget, if you enjoyed this countdown, hit that like button, subscribe for more deep dives into the wild stories of music history, and ring the bell so you never miss a new upload. After all, in rock and roll, there's always another story waiting to be told.